Sexism has a number of definitions, but it's generally defined as prejudice, stereotyping or discrimination, typically against women, on the basis of their sex. And the aim of this plenary session is to discuss sexism in journalism, science journalism and science communication, and crucially to explore ways to improve not only how we deal with sexism, but how we actually do our jobs as well. Now, our jobs are, no matter what media you're in, they're primarily involve language, and language is a powerful weapon. And if sexism is used in language, it reflects how certain attitudes are endemic within our society. And I'd like to quote this obituary from the New York Times from last year. This is how it opened. She made a mean beef stroganoff, followed her husband from job to job, and took 8 years off from work to raise 3 children. The world's best mom, her son Matthew said. But Yvonne Brill, who died on Wednesday at 88 in Princeton, New Jersey, was also a brilliant rocket scientist who in the early 1970s invented a propulsion system to help keep communication satellites from slipping out of their orbits. Now, more recently in the UK, the Daily Mail insinuated that the only reason 2 extremely qualified women scientists were on Newsnight was because of their gender and their race. Now, the idea for this session was born after a number of quite high-profile events around 6 months ago. Last October, the American scientist Danielle Lee, who blogs as the urban scientist for Scientific American, she was called an urban whore by an editor at Biology Online purely for asking whether she would be paid for a blog. And it resulted in the editor's resignation. After that, Scientific American's blog editor, Bora Zivkovic, he was outed by several women science writers for sexual harassment, and he too lost his job. And it prompted a very, very lively discussion about sexism within science journalism as well, that is actually still going on both sides of the Atlantic. And utterly coincidentally, I played a sort of small part in this by a piece that I'd written for the Telegraph around the same time about what I saw as the rising popularity of male-dominated Top Gear-style blokey formats on British television. Men too, I hasten to add, were not happy about that either. So as many scientists have crossover careers, where they also write books, present radio programmes, blog, etc., there will be some overlap between scientists and science journalists here, but this is primarily about you, me, our members, and our experiences, and how we can go forward and do something positive as a result. And to help do that, we have 3 guests here on our panel who are going to give a brief discussion for around 10 minutes or so from their individual standpoints, and then after that we'll open the debate to the floor. Our first speaker is the NUJ General Secretary, Michelle Stanistreet, who also writes a regular column for the Journalist magazine on issues facing the media industry with journalists. And Michelle's going to start with an overview of sexism within the journalism profession.
Thanks very much, Sue. I was really pleased to be asked to come and join the panel today because this is an area of work since I became General Secretary in 2011 that we've really tried to spend some time addressing as a union. And at that time, it became clear that there was a need for a real renewed focus on this because what we were seeing both anecdotally and through our officials and the experiences of members in workplaces was that the economic downturn that was hitting at that time, resulting in waves of cuts and redundancies, was actually resulting in many of our women members being picked off as the first casualties of those waves of redundancies. And particularly targeted were women who were returning or newly returned from maternity leave, or those that were working already part-time or flexibly. And some of the examples that we saw at that time and since were about as blatant as they come with, for example, in one national newspaper, 3 women, just the 3 women who had recently returned from maternity leave in the entire editorial bargaining unit, being put into one selection pool rather than put the entire editorial workforce into the selection pool and trawl for volunteers. They were very deliberately targeted, and it resulted in quite handsome payoffs for some of the women involved, but obviously that isn't a result that actually necessarily changes behaviour within those workplaces. But it was one of many examples that we saw building at that time, and it was a particularly damaging kind of reaction, I think, as a result of the cuts in the broader industry. And it's a particular problem in those pockets of the industry where men still dominate in senior editorial positions and where flexible working just hasn't been embraced or seen as a constructive and positive way of keeping skilled and experienced women journalists on board when they have children. So from our perspective as a union, in terms of we see the daily casualties of many kind of managerial decisions in the workplaces, I think it's clear to say that sexism is absolutely still alive and kicking in the broader industry. I'm really interested to hear how it's manifesting in science journalism specifically as we talk about it today. We also saw in a survey that the NUJ did in 2012, experiences of sexism in many different formats featured quite heavily in work that we did just with our women journalists at that time. And participants in the survey highlighted a number of things, but one of them was how women in the workplaces were being disproportionately hit, as I mentioned, but also with senior women being often first out of the door as well, which was another concerning trend, because certainly in parts of the industry, senior women really are outnumbered by their male counterparts. So to see the result of some movements forward in having more senior women in decision-making positions actually losing those jobs was a source of concern for many of our workplace reps and the women affected who were raising this with us. They also pointed to the fact that there's still quite an old boys club approach to jobs and recruitment. So getting jobs in the first place, there are still barriers that exist to women. Many jobs are still not advertised, and salary structures are often more opaque than they should be. Numerous of those respondents explained how their career had taken an unexpected turn when they had children, that up until that point, actually, they had had quite positive experiences in work, and it was as a result of becoming parents that actually they felt the whole attitude towards them as journalists had changed. Many reported examples of sexual harassment in the workplace, which is something that we've taken on very seriously since. One young woman reporter reported being sacked as a junior reporter in a magazine after she refused what she described as the creepy editor's interest in me. Another recounted a very shocking anecdote of how she was sexually assaulted by a more senior colleague, and rather than risk what she felt would be damage to her own working reputation, she actually left that job rather than report the assault, which was very shocking reading that first-person testimony when that story came in. One of the things that we've all seen, and I think it's affected all parts of the industry, is this explosion in internships in recent years, and it's opened up that whole new area of exploitation, with competition very rife for roles that often don't even pay expenses, let alone the minimum rates for the jobs. And the NUJ has been contacted by some female interns who've come to the union for help and support because of examples of abuse that they've been experiencing, particularly with more senior male colleagues, seeing them really as prey within the workplace, making advances to them, making suggestions that actually, you know, if they hooked up with them, that they could play a really important role in developing their career. And it's really depressing when you hear these stories that the journalistic equivalent of the casting couch is still alive and kicking in the 21st century. And I think it adds another kind of toxic twist to the exploitation that internships can often present. So we've been doing an awful lot of work with our young members on internships, on trying to ensure that people are paid for the work that they're doing and that proper support mechanisms are in place in those workplaces where they exist. But it is a much broader problem than simply women at a certain stage in their life or of younger members. And a survey that we did last year, we did a huge piece of work with all of our members, past and present, at the BBC, looking at, it was in the wake of the Diana Rose review, looking at examples of bullying and harassment and drawing anonymised testimony from them. And some of those accounts were eye-watering, and you could probably tick every equality strand when you're looking at the experiences that people had endured. But sexual harassment and abuse formed a strong part of the report that we then compiled into a dossier of evidence. It also highlighted, I think interestingly, the trend of women being sidelined when they're seen as being the wrong side of 50, when they're not put on presenting roles in the same way as their equally wrinkled male counterparts happily are at the BBC. And I think this issue of the double whammy of racism and sexism and age, and a triple whammy if you add race into the mix of that, is a real prevalent problem in our public service broadcaster, no less, as well as many other employers in the industry. It also, as a body of evidence, demonstrated a number of patterns in the way the BBC as an employer had responded to this behaviour within the workplace, and also to complaints that a lot of people had actually tried to bring complaints to get problems sorted out. But what they often reported was actually the consequence of that is that it's the victim, the person who's brought the complaint, who's sidelined, somehow seen as the problem, while perpetrators, the bullies and the harassers are kind of at best moved sideways, sometimes even promoted and allowed to carry on that kind of behaviour elsewhere. And it also raised another issue that I think does exist when tackling issues of sexism, is if you're a freelance or a casual worker, you've got an added barrier in bringing, making your voice heard in the first place, because a lot of freelancers report really genuinely fearing that if they stick up for themselves or put their head above the parapet, then it'll just mean that work will dry up and they won't get that commissions in the future. And that is an added barrier that makes it really important that in every way possible, whether it's colleagues in workplaces, whether it's through the NUJ, that kind of collective support and tackling these problems is one that affects all of us and shouldn't just be individualised. We're working through that that has resulted in new investigations, a lot of different policy tweaking going on at the BBC, but hopefully what we're pressing for is genuine cultural change in terms of how that organisation functions and how journalists within that are treated and should be treated fairly and properly. We've also done an awful lot of work trying to engage as well with our workplace chapels, it's what we call them in the NUJ, in the newspaper sector and beyond in other parts of the industry about what's been a huge growth area of sexism, which is the explosion in the kind of below-the-line comments of online news and journalism. And a lot of journalists put under a lot of pressure to engage positively with readers, when actually if you take as a snapshot of the mindset of some of those readers in the below-the-line comments, then the misogyny and sexism is something quite to behold. And it's not something that employers have grasped as robustly as they should have done. I mean, we've had a lot of examples of women being threatened, sexual threats made, threats of rape made in these kind of commentaries. And really, it's something that employers need to take a lead on and take a responsibility for. It's not content or material that would have ever made it through to the editor's letters page, yet it's there for all to see, and it's clearly a source of pressure for many of our members. So on the whole gamut of sexism, it's an issue that has engaged the NUJ, continues to do, and that we do a lot of work in reaction to issues that members bring to us as well. So whether it's the things that I've highlighted, or equal pay, flexible working, or as Sue said, language is incredibly powerful. We do a lot of work on reporting guidelines and also on the broader issue of the representation of women in the media, which we all have a responsibility for as journalists. It's all a body of work that we're very focused on at the NUJ. And I'd just add to what Martin was saying before, that if there is anyone who isn't a member of the NUJ at the moment and would like to talk, I'm quite happy to cure you of that as well. So please do come and see me afterwards, or have a look at our website and you can join up there as well. But I'm glad to be here today, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about what's happening with science journalists as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is going to now narrow down some of those issues to science journalism in particular. The ABSW recently held a survey on sexism among its members and those of the Medical Journalists Associations. And slightly disappointingly, in fact, although I'm told this is part of the course when you do surveys, only 40 people took part. So while the results certainly don't represent the whole membership, it did give us a small insight into our own specialism. For example, out of the 21 women who responded to the question if they'd been personally affected by sexism, for instance, 8 said yes, which is a pretty high proportion. Dr. Joan Harron is an independent researcher working on topics at the intersection of gender studies, cultural studies and science and technology. Between 2004 and 2013, she was a research fellow in media culture and genomics at the ESRC Centre for Economic and Social Aspects of Genomics at Cardiff University. And Joan was also a member of a team based at Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, commissioned by the UK Research Council to research UK media representations of women in science, engineering and technology. Well, Jane interviewed 10 ABSW members about their experiences of sexism in science journalism, and she will be revealing some of her findings from those case studies today.
Okay, thanks very much. So it's great that Michelle started off by giving the broader context, because the research that I'm going to report on today is just a very small sample of the membership of the ABSW. Like Michelle, I'm really pleased to participate in this panel, and I look forward to the audience discussion of the topic. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the people who did participate in the questionnaire, and also the 10 people who gave up time to be interviewed. So as already mentioned, this research was prompted by a number of high-profile incidents of sexism in the broad field of science journalism, as well as public and private disclosures by a number of women science journalists of their experiences of sexism, and sometimes they were compounded by racism. So the ABSW decided to investigate the prevalence of sexism in the science journalism community at this moment at which the issue has an extremely high public profile. So sexism as a term is very broad. People use it to refer to many issues regarding gender and sexuality, and it encompasses, as we've already heard, a host of widely ranging behaviours, which include inappropriate sexualised humour in the workplace, coercing employees into unwanted sexual relations for fear of threats to their employment, sexual assault at the extreme, and inequitable treatment in hiring, firing and the assignment of work. And obviously we couldn't address all of those issues in either the questionnaire or the interviews, but the research conducted in a very compressed time does begin to suggest some areas that would be well worth addressing. And I'm going to set out the areas that would be worth addressing first before I go into the case studies, because I think it would be interesting to have those in your mind while I'm talking about the case studies. So one of the things that did come up across a number of the interviews was the fact that prolonged and repeated contact with sources without witnesses, either for very good journalistic reasons or due to insufficient attention to risk by employers, leaves women journalists vulnerable. So, for example, meeting sources in laboratories, in hotels at conferences, and in bars or cafes where informal conversations are had. So such working routines that mean journalists encounter sources away from their place of employment make the problem one for the individual rather than for the organisation to deal with. So there are concerns that employers can shirk their duty of care to employees, and that there's a need for clearer procedures to be followed and some form of reporting that doesn't require the person offended always to be proactive, that maybe there could be some environment that invites more discussion. One of the other issues that came up was that organisations attempt to minimise bad publicity associated with claims of sexual discrimination or sexual harassment can leave individuals out on a limb. But it can also backfire on organisations which fail to follow documented procedures. But compounding the harm caused by harassment with lack of action or inappropriate action on the part of employers can be even more damaging, or at least as damaging, for the people suffering harassment. Dr. Jennifer Freyd, who's in the Department of Psychology at the University of Oregon, uses the term institutional betrayal to refer to this type of behaviour. She calls them wrongdoings perpetrated by an institution on individuals who are dependent on that institution. And she includes, as one of the key forms of institutional betrayal, failure to prevent or to respond supportively to wrongdoings such as sexual harassment committed in the context of the institution. And as I've already suggested, the context of the institution for many science journalists is much broader than kind of people in the street might imagine. It's not just at your desk in the office, it's at conferences and hotels. It's in all the informal places at which networking with sources is done. In addition to this, as kind of Michelle has already suggested, high profiles and accessibility through social media leave journalists vulnerable if they're being harassed. And finally, harassing behaviour is often incremental, and because of its incremental nature, it's sometimes very hard for women or the men to whom it happens to stop the behaviour, to nip it in the bud, because they give the harasser or the perpetrator the benefit of the doubt and hope that by holding them at bay, the behaviour will change. Then if it doesn't, A, it becomes normalised, and B, it becomes harder to raise it as an issue because, well, you didn't complain before. So, to the interviews. The interviews were conducted by phone and ranged in duration from about 30 to about 90 minutes, depending on what was acceptable to the interviewee and how much they wanted to say on the topic. Also, some respondents to the questionnaires provided brief narrative answers, and I'll report on those in the written report that follows, but I probably won't have time to talk about them today. And of the interviewees, the least amount of time spent in science journalism was 5 years, but some of the journalists had spent over 25 years in the business. And in addition, the journalist with the least experience in science journalism had also worked in a general TV newsroom beforehand, so she was already an experienced journalist. They'd worked for the national press, for specialist science journals, for TV, radio and online, and some had also written popular science books. So just trying to indicate that the interviewees are actually a very successful fraction of your membership. Out of those 10 interviewees, 2 women journalists reported very serious cases of sexual harassment. Another 4 women mentioned what one of them referred to as nuisance rather than intimidatory instances of sexual harassment by sources or by other media professionals, often, as I've suggested, at conferences or parties. Places where women feel very much that they're still at work. They understand these to be workplaces, even if they're outside the context of an office environment. But one of the interviewees said that there seems to be some understanding or expectation by some men in these contexts that it's an opportunity to play away from home, and that therefore that's something that women have to deal with. The remaining 2 women interviewees had neither experienced or witnessed either harassment or sexist treatment. So I'm not saying that this is endemic in the industry necessarily. Of the 2 male journalists interviewed, both with over 25 years' experience in science journalism, one said that he had never been aware of sexism in his organisation, while the other was quite adamant that he'd observed female science journalists being treated with far less respect than their male peers. And in fact, he felt that assumptions were made that elevated his credentials and qualifications at the same time as assumptions were made which diminished the credentials and expertise of women journalists. And he mentioned a number of concrete examples, which I can talk about in the question time. None of the interviewees had experienced any physical sexual assaults, but one of the respondents to the questionnaire had. She reported being grabbed and kissed by a male colleague while a sniggering female colleague looked on. So this is not just a battle of the sexes question by any manner of means. At the time, this journalist was the only journalist in an NHS office, and like one of the members that Michelle mentioned, she left the job soon after this incident rather than report it, as she felt it wouldn't be taken seriously. But she regrets that after the fact, because she thought that she would at least then have laid down a trail if that person had behaved in the same way again. So some of the interviewees provided much more detail than they're happy to have reported in an open forum, and it's important to be aware that this ambivalence, a genuine desire to speak out so as to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, is undercut by a realistic assessment of the resultant risk to career and reputation. This is typical in the arena of sexual harassment and not peculiar to science journalism. But I can say, one of the female journalists reported that a male source who also worked elsewhere in the media made repeated sexual overtures to her, despite being politely but firmly rejected on his first attempt. When she continued to rebuff him, he made concerted attempts to damage her professional reputation through making unfounded allegations against her in various professional arenas. Another female interviewee gave a detailed account of harassment in the workplace, but asked that it not be discussed at this conference because of her fear that the harasser might be in the audience. The nuisance harassment experienced by other interviewees included a male presenter telling a female journalist that she had a nice pair of tits, and male scientists pestering young women journalists to join them at their hotel rooms at overseas conferences. And this sometimes persisted over several days and included phone calls to the women journalists' rooms. But in terms of discrimination in hiring or work allocation practices, only 2 of the women interviewed believed that they'd been discriminated against when applying for science journalist posts. One was offered an unrelated and much junior post, and one saw the post for which she was perfectly qualified go to a male journalist with no specialist science journalism experience. Happily, the other 6 women didn't mention this as an issue. In fact, one of the women, a technology journalist, reported a conversation with a former editor of a technology section in a broadsheet who claimed to have operated informal positive discrimination in favour of qualified women journalists because he thought that would make the section more attractive to female readers. One of the other male interviewees noted that, the other male interviewee noted that in a former post as the chief sub-editor on a weekly science magazine, he had appointed more women than men. But this wasn't a campaign of positive discrimination, he said. It was simply that there were more outstanding women in the pool of applicants. So 2 of the women interviewed mentioned working in environments where they believed they were discriminated against in the allocation of stories because of their gender, although one of these was in a TV newsroom prior to her specialising in science journalism. And in this instance, a male newsroom boss kept sending her out to make the tea until she walked out saying that she wouldn't work with him any further until he started assigning her stories. And for her, this proved to be a successful strategy, but she noted that it was dependent on her having the confidence to risk losing her job, an option which isn't open to many. The other journalists did not raise the sexism in allocation of stories as an issue, but simply carried on competing and going after her own stories over which she could claim ownership. Now, on a positive note, 2 publications in particular were mentioned by 2 of the women journalists and one of the male journalists I interviewed as being particularly supportive of workplaces for women. In fact, one of the women points out that a senior male editor on one of these publications is explicitly anti-sexist, and she thinks that this has been important for setting the culture of that particular title to be egalitarian. Nevertheless, one of the women journalists who's still on staff at one of these titles, although extremely positive about her working environment, did say that she felt she was left on her own to deal with the kind of harassment that goes on at conferences and business parties. However, she did note that in the wake of the Savile affair, there'd been much discussion of these issues and that a senior male editor had re-evaluated his own practice and said that he now realised that he'd behaved wrongly in simply warning young women about well-known harassers in the wider industry, rather than taking action about it when he was in a position to do so. So conversations like the one mentioned above are obviously a starting point, but if they don't result in changed behaviour, how helpful are they? One of the women journalists that I spoke to mentioned a discussion with a friend and colleague who works at one of her previous employers and learnt that that organisation's HR manual does in fact have a procedure in place for employees who are harassed off-site. And this interviewee was keen to see something similar implemented at her own organisation and was supported in this by her staff council representative, but had been unsuccessful in getting this taken up due to lack of concern from representatives at other publications in the parent company. But this was just one of a number of solutions. Mentoring of younger women, again, was something that was suggested, but again, action hadn't been taken. So I'm conscious that I'm running out of time. This is just a very small sample, and these are preliminary findings, but I'll be happy to say more about the detail in questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker is science journalist, editor and Huffington Post blogger Priya Shetty, who focuses on global health, especially human rights and women's issues. Now, Priya has been a staff editor at New Scientist and The Lancet and has reported from around the world for the BBC, The Guardian and Nature.
Thank you. I think I'm going to do away with the slides, actually.
Okay.
I might have them. Hi, everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got into thinking about sexism in science and science journalism. Now, for nearly 15 years, I've looked at issues like equity, equality, how women are treated, gender imbalances in global health, which is what I specialise in. But I've always ignored these issues at home. And the cases that Sue mentioned earlier, they really brought home to me the fact that actually these inequalities do exist in science journalism, but often women kind of dismiss them because there are, these cases of casual sexism or anecdotes of harassment, and we all just sort of say, oh, well, it's not great, but, what can you do about it? And I set up a group called Sexism in Science to talk about these issues, because what it seemed to me overwhelmingly was that people talked amongst themselves in quiet conversations in cafes or restaurants, but they weren't having open conversations, and probably because they're very difficult conversations to have. So what I first talk about, a couple of roadblocks that we identified in moving things forward, and then try to outline a manifesto for some kind of action. So the first thing really is when I blogged about the Bora Zivkovic scandal, there were some really interesting reactions, and there were two things that came up. The first one was, well, why don't we just empower women to speak up, and a lot of people saying, oh, the women journalists I know are really feisty, they'd have no problem pushing their story in an editorial meeting. And the problem with this is that there isn't really an empowering, encouraging environment for which women to speak up. So when women do say something, they're often not taken very seriously. Sometimes they suffer really serious consequences. They may be demoted, moved to another department. Some women have been fired. And so when you've struggled very hard to make it to a certain point in journalism, as probably all of you know, it's not a very easy field in which to progress. You don't really want to risk that because someone made you feel a bit uncomfortable one day. So that's the first thing. Just telling women to speak up isn't enough. We need institutions, we need publications, we need media outlets really to be very explicit in their guidelines and their institutional processes and their HR departments in terms of how they're going to deal with this and actually commit to dealing with this quite seriously. The second point is that and I found this a lot in response to the blog about Bora, a lot of men saying, oh, well, not all men are like this, and you can't tar us all with the same brush. And that might seem like a small issue, but actually getting into that kind of debate is very distracting because, first of all, no one is saying it's all men are like this. That it's kind of an ego-driven comment to make in the first place. But what ends up happening when you engage with trying to have these minutiae of details about what men are like and are men like this and are men sometimes just trying to get a date and is that appropriate? It actually distracts from a much bigger issue. So to move on to the idea of the manifesto, which sounds like a very grand term for it, but it's not really. I mean, we're not saying that this is a blueprint, more that it's a way to spark conversation and debate. And the first thing, really, is to keep talking about it, because as Joan says, there is this dichotomy where some people go, when you talk to them about it, they say, oh, yes, we know all about this, and, they've heard these stories many, many times. And other people are horrified. And the fact that you have these two very opposing views within what is actually a very small industry seems to me an indication that there is a real code of silence, or actually more a culture of open secrets where people know who these serial offenders are and they sort of nod, when you kind of mention names, but no one actually wants to talk about it any further. But it's imperative that we do talk about it, I think. The second point is remembering that this all stems from a place of respect, really. So some people did respond by saying, well, if we start to have all these quite restrictive guidelines and ways of telling us how we talk to colleagues and how we don't, and won't people not know how to behave with each other? And I really don't think that's true. I mean, there are rules in every aspect of society, and we don't need a whole new set of social rules. What we need, really, is a bit of internal recalibration where, broadly, we generally know, or a lot of people know when they're being sexist, or even if they don't know, if you start from a place of respect and you start from an idea of not necessarily treating someone a certain way because of their gender, that's a good starting point. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be fixed. You still need policies and you still need processes for when things go wrong. But I think respect is a good place to start. The third point that I want to talk about is creating waves, and this is a very difficult thing to do. And I think women in particular really think about how their gender affects the way they're perceived in the workplace. Either they don't want to be too aggressive or too prominent, And, women are often told to take up as little space as possible and not to make a fuss and not to create problems. Or women like to be very assertive and very aggressive, and they almost want to behave as if, crass behaviour or language or unwanted advances don't bother them, because they want to be seen to be above their gender. But what both of those attitudes end up doing is silencing women. And it means that people just don't say anything, whether because they don't want to be too much of a problem or because they want to make it seem as if they don't have a problem at all. And creating waves can feel uncomfortable, whether you're a man or a woman. But the point is, this isn't pushing for special treatment or pushing for some kind of, special women's rights. This is really just about equality. Which leads me to the next point, and that this really is about men and women. These issues often, because women tend to suffer them disproportionately, things like sexism, harassment, they're always made into these niche women's issues. But they're not. I mean, if women aren't being treated equally, that's a problem for men as well. This is a societal issue. And making it a woman's issue makes it her problem to solve as well, which isn't fair. And the place that all of this is going to start, which is my final point really, is looking at people in positions of influence, and I mean both men and women, because they really have the power to push the agenda, to set the tone. Often women in particular, senior women scientists or senior women journalists I've spoken to, because they've managed, however, whether they've experienced sexism or harassment or they choose not to see it, they don't then want to acknowledge that it might exist for younger women or for more junior women, but they do actually have a responsibility to create an empowering and a safe environment in which men or women who experience this can really stand up and say they have experienced it, that they're taken seriously, and that they're treated with respect. And so the final point that I really want to say is that although these issues, they're talked about a lot, as Michelle was saying, across journalism, they're talked about across different professions, finance, science, the law. This isn't something peculiar to science journalism. We're not pretending that it is. But personally, I think we as a profession really have an obligation to look into this, because more than any other profession almost, we're trained to interrogate assumptions, to look below the surface, to confront things that are uncomfortable to us. And science is an egalitarian endeavour, and it's meant to be equal. And if there is evidence, even if it's anecdotal, that equality doesn't exist, then I think we do have a duty to look into that.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to just briefly sum up that sexism sort of manifesto, talk about it, respect, create waves. It's a men and a women's issue, and use your influence. And I don't know whether you've also heard of the Finkbeiner test, which was put together by a freelancer and named after one of her colleagues, who is a science writer. It was to pass the Finkbeiner test, the story cannot mention the fact that she's a woman, her husband's job, her childcare arrangements, how she nurtures her underlings, how she was taken aback by the competitiveness in her field, how she's a role model for other women, or how she's the first woman too. Now, I'm not sure I've passed all of those tests there, but it is quite interesting perhaps whether we do need either our own sort of test for writing, and the woman who came up with that Finkbeiner test that said, yes, it is okay to mention some things about a woman if you're writing about sexism in science or about the gender gap in leadership roles or about sex-related issues. But she said what it's not okay is to turn a story about a scientist's professional life into one about her personal life or her gender roles. So at this point, I'd like to open up to the floor for questions. If your question is specifically to one member of our panel, then please say so. If you'd like to identify who you are as well, and whether you're a freelance or who you work for, because that's always useful to hear for other members. And we do have 2 roving microphones, so if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone, so that way we can ensure that everybody has heard your question or comment. Stunned into silence. think buying a test then, I think, is a good place to start. Yes, we do have a question at the back there, please.
Hi, I'm Mitch Tatowicz. I'm news editor at Side of Net. My question is about how open we are in the UK, UK science journalism community about this issue. Because just talking to people about Boris Živković, for example, I've had women telling me that they've had much worse experiences, for example, in the UK, and we've heard from the panel, similar sort of anecdotes. So, but should we be outing people? Should we be more open about, sexism and individual cases, or should we just keep the conversations quite general as we are doing now?
Who would like to answer that first?
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, because the one thing that came up with the Boris Živković, especially a lot of the sort of Twitter fury, was people saying, oh, he's been such a well-respected person in his field, and often people talk about the men who are these perpetrators, saying, well, they've got such an illustrious career, and so they somehow then place the blame of that career being destroyed or potentially tarnished on the woman, which seems to be incredible, because if you don't want to destroy your career, then don't harass someone. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we have sort of, there are very clear legal processes to go through and institutional processes, and I think they should be followed, and having things like trial by social media isn't necessarily fair. However, if you're talking about something that someone has done and has openly admitted to doing, I don't really see how that's tarnishing their behaviour. And so I think I would be in favour, personally, of being more open, provided you are then willing to back it up. So I don't just mean, making a nasty comment on a blog somewhere and then kind of running away. I mean, you do need to be able to follow through that process. But I think more openness, whatever that forum is, it may not be going online and telling the whole world about it, but at least being open with your institution or with that person's institution is probably a good way, the only way things are going to change.
Anybody else like to address that?
I think it's a really interesting question. But I mean, one of the issues about openness is the kind of the risk that women perceive that they are running to their reputation if they are open. So it's kind of identifying individuals quite often ends up kind of identifying kind of both parties or multiple parties to the kind of the particular set of incidents, and because of entrenched sexism in either within their organisation or kind of in kind of the wider society, they can feel that the long-term penalties for speaking out outweigh any kind of individual or even kind of collective good that can come from that. So I do think it's one where kind of the work needs to be done to change the climate in which the speech happens, and that's what the attention needs to be given to.
And doesn't that bring us to you, Michelle, about the fact that actually departments and workplaces need better processes where people can, because it's not just women. I mean, I have worked with a male reporter who did leave London to work in the region specifically because he was being sexually harassed by a female editor. So it's not all one way. But you need where you feel comfortable that there isn't this, I love that phrase, institutional betrayal. Yeah. And also for freelancers, because I suspect a lot of people here are freelancers, so that freelancers can go to the company that is employing them and not feel as though that's it, there's that avenue lost forever. And that's a revenue, an economic hit of potentially thousands or tens of thousands of pounds over a lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think having the processes and the policies in organisations or institutions is really important. It's not the answer in and of itself. They've got to be, sometimes it's about them being more than just the words on a piece of paper, that they're actually policed and implemented properly is really important. I think the issue of people talking together about it can often, I mean, the work at the BBC that we did, when people started talking to other colleagues about things, what they actually began to realise themselves, that actually it's not just me. You know, I'm not alone in this. This isn't just an issue that's affected me. Actually, this particular guy has done this to people successively over years in some cases. And I think one of the problems that also threw up is the perception, particularly when we're talking about senior members of staff, that somehow there are a breed of people who are untouchable, that actually they can get away with whatever they like. They've got license to do that. And tackling that, I think, is really important, because what you'll see is when you have a case that's brought an investigation, you know, even if it doesn't always get the outcome that we might wish, the whole process of going through that and people knowing it's happening and knowing that something's being done to tackle what's essentially completely inappropriate behaviour, it changes how people behave themselves. You know, it's a basic thing. It's knowing that your behaviour might have consequences is a very, very influential thing, I think. So talking about it and addressing it, whether it's not necessarily just in a naming and shaming way, but in a way that goes through a proper, fair process, is really critical, I think.
Yes, please, so at the front here with the microphone. Just here, second row.
Len Fisher from the University of Bristol, freelance. I think that's a very good point, Sue, about freelancers, and not just applying to sexism. I'm just going to suggest it's a good idea to keep an eye on what's being said about you. I picked up one a little while ago, and you'll see the relevance, of a television person a producer writing to someone about me and saying, yeah, would this be a good person? Well, yes, came the reply, but he might be a little old, and you might get the same sorts of, but she's a woman, whatever. Keep an eye on what's being said about you. My response was to write to the person who'd said it and point out the damage they were doing. I did get an apology, but it's one thing is to keep an eye on what is actually being said about you.
Yeah, well, that's, I actually did hear recently of a producer who refused to use a cameraman who was over 50, because they said they wanted a fresh look. And this is a very experienced, and it is shocking. I think where ageism, as has been mentioned, is that you often find there are other things that seem to affect, ageism affects everyone, men and women, absolutely. With women, it seems to, you know, I've sort of made a list of the worst sort of combination you could be, which was black, over 50, freelance, and I assume doing fertility treatment, because if you were on maternity leave, then you've just got no chance from the sound of it. It's just, you know, awful. And it's that thing, is the way there are certain ways of working that particularly affect women disproportionately than men. There was a hand up there at the side there, please.
Wendy Grossman, freelance. I apologize if you've covered this because I did come in late. But what do you see as the role of other people who see something wrong to report it or to sort of advocate on behalf of the person who's being harassed? Because one of the really notable things in the Jimmy Savile case was the number of people who said, well, yes, there were rumors. And if 25 people had talked to each other, they would have had a case. Okay. And I don't think that 25 people could have been ignored.
Michelle, what would you say?
Absolutely. Talking about it, finding ways of supporting the individual, but at the same time encouraging them to feel that they can raise something formally is really important, I think. I mean, I would say so, wouldn't I? I mean, I think it's one of the things that a trade union in a workplace brings to the picture, because it is that source of collective support. People can find it incredibly hard to raise an issue that is about themselves, you know, about any issue in that regard. And what a union does is it gives the framework for somebody to help you along that road. And I think that is often, you know, in workplaces where there are organised trade unions, generally speaking, tend to have these issues as part of their agenda. You know, trying to make those workplaces healthier is part of the work of a trade union, and I think having that support makes a difference to people.
And do you think, say, the ABSW should provide guidelines, general guidelines for how to write about, if you're writing profiles on women scientists or writing about scientists, in terms of thinking about how you describe them? I'm assuming that obit, for example, was probably written by a general reporter rather than a science writer, but those sort of issues can affect us as well?
Yeah, I mean, we've got report and guidelines on a whole range of different subjects, including sexism. So we put those out regularly to our members. I mean, sometimes it's just about taking stock and thinking, isn't it? You know, often journalists are kind of a bit on autopilot or are working to ridiculous deadlines and trying to churn out copy. That is the reality for a lot of people, and I think it's easy to make lazy mistakes, but I think guidelines are an important practical tool.
Right, well, I know, I'm conscious, I'm sorry, I know there are more questions, but I know we started a little bit late, but it would be good to try and keep to time, otherwise it will have a massive knock-on effect. We do have a video a short video that we would like to play to you. It was a Skype interview by Connie St. Louis with the journalist, blogger and academic Deborah Bloom. She's one of the organisers of the NASW, which is the American version of the ABSW. They held a meeting last week, and they went a step further. They actually held what they called a solutions summit to try and come up with lasting changes. If we could play that now, please.
Up at our end was that so many today are freelancers. And from the women science journalists at our meeting consistently said, yes, I have editors who are sexually inappropriate, but I don't have any power. I'm a freelancer. I'm not in, there's no HR that has its so-called warm arms around me. I'm dependent on the goodwill of this person for my income, and I don't really see that I have any options aside from that wouldn't. And we talked about retaliation because it was pretty clear that there were some instances where women had said, you can't treat me like this, and then never gotten another job. So we're talking about doing a thing where we look at like a collection of publications that do publish science and saying, we want to get a collection of what your human resources policies are for contractors as well as staffers. If I'm a contractor and I'm treated this way, what are my options? Can I go to the HR department? Who's the person? What kind of protections do I have? And making that almost a database so that if you were a young freelancer or an old freelancer, doesn't really matter, and you found yourself in that position, you could look and see if you did have options. And we're also hoping if we do something like that, we're contacting publications, we are aware of this, that it sends a message. And so, we're looking at some of those kind of what can we put in your hand things. And the other discussion we had is probably the one that you all are also having, which is that, it hasn't really paid us as women to be nice and polite about this. Right? Enough with being the nice girl thing, right? We have to really stand up and make a noise. In fact, I basically said that in the plenary, right? We're never going to move this forward if we don't make a noise, right? All the times that, you go and you bitch to your friends over coffee about the way someone treated you, and that's as far as it goes, didn't change anything, right? You felt better for venting. But I think we have to change this. I don't want to be geezing around in my walker at the age of 90 and having this, which is how I imagine myself, and having this conversation again. Enough. So we had that conversation too. And Paula Apsel, who is director of NOVA, the public science television program at WGBH in Boston, started yelling at us at our plenary panel, saying, you guys are just girls. You're too nice. You've got to quit being so nice. And so Emily's going, really, we can be very mean when we have to. But I think she has a point, right? Not that you want to go out there, with your, waving your battle axe a la Carrie Nation. But I think we do need to push more than we've pushed, or we're never going to change anything.
So what's pushing look like? How do we get more impolite? How do we make a noise and make it matter?
Yeah, that's like, the million dollar question. I think that we start building a platform where people feel safe doing that. I mean, and I think a lot of the problem is people don't feel safe. So the more we have organizations like ours say, we're taking this on as a major issue, we're going to develop these resources, and possibly, if there's really a problem, we're going to have a dedicated, and we've talked about this too, a dedicated representative from our organization who goes in and says, here, we're really perceiving this problem. One of the issues that came up at our end was that so many science journalists working today are freelancers.
Thank you. Well, I think probably this is the sort of, hopefully, the beginning of further discussions amongst the membership in terms of what concrete action can be made, and whether we do need a manifesto, as Priya suggested, whether we do need guidelines for our profession that are not just general ones from the NUJ, but that are specific to the way in which we as science communicators and journalists actually work. But I would like to thank our panel. I'm sure people will be discussing this later on during the day, during coffee and what have you, to Joan Horan, Michelle Stanistreet and Priya Shetty. Thank you.